Good morning. We play music to get you woken up after the third day of your conference. We wanted to make sure. I think, Heather, you might have to stop sharing your computer sound at this point. Can y'all hear me? Okay. We were playing the music through the Zoom link. Wanted to wake y'all up. So good morning. Glad to get some energy going. You know, you got to pull it together. Yay. Okay. So we're going to talk to you about moving forward board diversity. I'm Jean Allen. I do consulting around board development and all sorts of ideas. I also teach with the Duke University Nonprofit Management Program. I do a lot of board source material. So if you need a reference, I know that Communities and Schools is a board source member, and a lot of the stuff we bring into this is from board source. I'm one of their certified governance consultants. I'm here presenting with Jonathan, who's going to introduce himself. I met Jonathan because he was a client that I worked with in New York. But I have to tell you a secret that's now public. Jonathan's been asked to be on the global AFP board, which is pretty amazing. And that's due to some of his work that he's been doing that we're going to talk about today. But I'm really excited. I feel like we have a rock star in the room. So, or you'll be the rock star. He joins the board in January. I think it was a secret 2 weeks ago. They had to officially vote him in. So welcome. And Jonathan, now that I've thoroughly embarrassed you, it's your turn.
Oh, thanks, Jean. Well, it's always great working with you. And good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you so much. I am coming in from Rochester, New York. I currently work at Villa of Hope. We are a nonprofit behavioral health organization, and I do fundraising communications, but I wear many hats. As Jean mentioned, I'll be joining the global board of the Association of Fundraising Professionals. I've been on personal boards myself. I'm going to talk about a board that I chaired, some experience from that recently too as well. And then where I met Jean was I worked for my local community foundation, and I managed our capacity building training. We brought Jean in, but we did a lot of training for nonprofits related to capacity building, but we also did a lot of board diversity work. So we did emerging leaders program for candidates. We just finished up a board inclusion series. We just released a roadmap. So I've done a lot of this great experience with it, and I'm kind of partnering with Jean to kind of help amplify your efforts. So thanks for having me.
Let's stick a slide up here. And now it's ready. Let's see, I'll share my screen. We'll get y'all going into, so you can see the screen. Yeah, thank you. I have learned the magic of working with multiple screens, but this sometimes means I think you see a screen and you don't. So I've learned to ask. So we put this together and we came up with 9 tips that we want to share. We want to get y'all to have some interaction, and depending on how quick we think the conversation will go, we might just have an open conversation. My next slide is our introductions, which we just did. So I'm not going to stick with that too long. But here we go. I want you to get thinking. Okay, we played a song to get you going. Now we got to get some visuals to get your brain moving. Which picture speaks to you concerning how your board is moving forward with diversity? So I just want you to pick a picture. Let's see. Heather, I do want to stick them in a breakout group just for pairs, and let's give them about two minutes. So we'll do a quick turnaround, and we got 6 people here. So let's just put them in a quick breakout group so people can wake up talking with only one other person. And what I want you to do in that breakout group is just speak to which picture you picked and why that just brings forth you how your board is moving forward with diversity. So we're trying to prime the pump and get you thinking this morning. We'll start with a visual. And if you're ready, let's put them in groups. Are you ready?
Yep, here we go. Well, Elizabeth, did you get your invite?
She looks frozen, so it probably means she did.
Oh, okay. She does, right?
You also need, yeah.
There she goes.
So it's a small group, but that's okay. I want to just get them talking to each other.
Exactly. No, that's good.
And then when they come back, we'll talk a little bit.
That's perfect. Here, we might have some late stragglers.
Well, if they show up, they can be part of it because we're going to talk about this. So they'll just join in that way.
Right. Right.
I mean, they seem to like the music, so let's keep them moving with some energy.
Exactly. No, I love it.
Hey, Jonathan.
They're gonna walk away with anything. They're going to walk away with some good feelings.
Exactly.
Jonathan, Jill is who I first knew at, she's in this, and she's now your executive director. But she's been there
Mhm.
6 or 8 years now.
Yeah, roughly. I'd say 6. She was on the board though before
Okay.
joining us in the office. So yeah, so she's probably 8 years in total
Where
with
did she work before? I forget. That's where I met her.
United Way. She was with
Right,
United
right.
Way.
I met her when she was at United Way. Yeah.
Yeah.
So how much time is left on this?
They have 25 seconds.
And did you give them any countdown, or will it shut down right
Yeah,
there?
no, I gave them a 30-second countdown.
Okay.
Yeah, I got about 10 seconds.
Thank you. You handled that well. Thanks for the.
Oh yeah, no problem. I've gotten the hang of it pretty much.
It takes some effort, yeah.
Yeah, you have to, you have to do it and practice it. Oh no, they're close. So I gave them a 30-second after the 2 minutes. So they're coming back. They'll come back now in about 20 seconds.
Yeah, that's fine.
So Heather, I think we're gonna maybe do one later depending on time. So if you want to get them ready.
Yes, I will.
Okay, perfect.
Yep.
We say that just because last time we did a session, they were like, wait until the last minute, and we were staring.
Oh,
at the
no,
screen like, oh.
I go ahead and start now. Yeah.
I have no judgment on your skills. I'm just we're reliving from past stuff.
Thank you.
Welcome back. Hope you had an interesting little conversation there. Just because we're a small group, I can do this. I'd like to hear from a couple of people who just raise your hand, who'd be willing to share what y'all talked about in your group. Who's willing to go first? It's always a risk when you do this. Just somebody, I'll call on one of you or ask you. I'm going to call on Elizabeth. What happened in your conversation, Elizabeth?
Hi.
Hello.
I feel bad that Jane did not get to finish her conversation, but she was talking about the cello in terms of for their affiliate and just the intentionality and the work that they really have been doing and diversifying their board. And so she had one and I had number 4. And we both were really resonating towards 6 too, but I picked 4 because of the different skill sets in addition to the diversity. And it sounded that Jane, I don't want to, she got caught off, but it sounded like they were really getting into the real rhythm, of really having a diverse board and everyone's contribution.
Great. How about Electa? What happened in your discussion?
So I was with Julie, and she and I are coming in it from a slightly different perspective. She's with CIS National, and I don't mean to speak for you, Julie, but I think she works with lots of different boards, but doesn't have her own particular one. And I'm coming in because I'm on another board, not a CIS board. I'm part-time with CIS, and then I'm the board chair for another group. So I'm like, okay, what can I get out of this for that? So for my board that's not related to us as a group, I chose the cello because I feel like it's a slow build. We're starting to get there. We're really small and we're starting to build.
Great, thanks. Let's see, Jill, who did you talk with?
I talked with Niles. We were in a group together and he picked number 1, the cello, because he said they have a great, and jump in, Niles, and help me out here if I don't get your story right, that they have a great diversity across the board and that they're really pulling skills and talents together to sound like an orchestra. And I picked number 4 because it's a whole host of tools. And when I think about us here at the state office, we're working to support not only our own work as our board is looking forward, but all the work of the affiliates. So we're looking at tools and how do we align and really make sure we have the right resources for folks at the right time.
Great, thank you. Let's see, I think Kevin joined in and we were just talking about pictures and how they represent the work we're doing in diversity, which one speaks to you. We're trying to get people's brains, slow moving Friday morning. So we're working with the visual. So let's move on. Kevin will bring you into the next conversation. What we're talking about today is we focused in on 3 pieces. Number 1 is looking at readiness. What can boards do to be ready? So they're not just jumping out and recruiting when they're not ready. Number 2, some actual hints around recruitment. And then number 3, the idea of how onboarding, how bringing people on can actually be another tool or another practice that can help you with moving forward with board diversity. So under each one of these, we're going to talk about 3 ideas. We're going to put a couple of things where we put you to talk together again, but we hope you'll just kind of ask questions out as we go, since we're a smaller group. Just kind of speak up if you want to hear something or add to it. So readiness is where we're starting. And the idea behind readiness is what it says here. How can boards encourage meaningful self-assessment? What we don't want to see is boards that are following some maybe gut feeling, maybe important value, and they just jump in to start recruiting and they don't do it in a way that's very productive. And so they have situations that don't work out for them and then they quit. So what we're hoping to do is saying, start with being ready, start with looking at what's going on in your own board before you start jumping out and recruiting. Diversity, Jonathan will talk about it in a minute with defining it, but it could be any number of ways, whether it's age or race or gender or religion, but you don't want to jump in and bring people in if you're not quite ready for it. So that's what we want to talk about here. So the idea behind assessing board readiness and creating a culture of inquiry. What a couple of ways you can assess board readiness is just to have some good conversations. You could have polls. And the reason I say polls is you can do that anonymously. So I'm working with another group, and one of the polls we're asking in that presentation is how important people think this is to their board work. And by doing it anonymously, we hope we can get a better sense of who's in the room. I'm going to ask you all some questions that might ask you to put it in the chat box, which works, but that's, we know, not anonymous. So sometimes polls are useful because they can bring in anonymous. Matrix, some of you, I know y'all promote using a matrix, right? You have some information around that? The people who are on boards here, Niles, does your board use anything like a matrix?
I'm sorry, I was trying to get off mute. When you say matrix, can you define that further?
Sure, I'm going to show a picture of it. Just the idea where you kind of look at maybe an Excel spreadsheet of who's on your board and what skill sets they have. And
Yes.
yeah, so
Yes.
we always highly recommend something like that. And there are a couple of reasons if you haven't done that yet. I'm going to show one in just a second, but thank you, Jane. The reason we recommend that, actually, this was in the time I was up in New York with Jonathan's group. One of the people in the group, who the board member, came up to me afterwards and said they had started using a board matrix. And he was so amazed of how useful it was to moving the conversation in his board, because it made it more from just recruiting the people you knew to more strategic. And as a board member, he'd never thought about it that way. So the idea of a matrix allowed him to look at it from who do we want to be on this board? What skill sets do we need? And to answer the question, what is it we want to accomplish this year? Before your board does a matrix, which I'll show you in just a minute. Number C is the idea of how can you encourage a culture of inquiry, is how can you get people chatting and talking and disagreeing with each other? So what I suggest here is when you're making decisions, when you're having conversations on your board, assigning people, this side of the room is the pro, this side's the con. Or if you have a list of who's in there, the A to J is on, you have to come up with the pros, and the K through Z's have to come up with the cons, so that you're assigning people a position rather than having people disagree. Why does this work? Because it teaches people to have discussions where they can disagree. It sets the tone that we don't all have to be thinking the same way. And by assigning people a role, it helps them to listen to each other, because now I'm arguing a position, but not my opinion. And that moves it away from just kind of, I really believe this strongly, to, okay, I'm really a pro, but I'm going to argue the con side here. And again, what you're teaching people is it's okay to disagree and have discussions, so that once you start bringing in diversity, which by itself was going to bring people in with different lived experiences who might bring in different points of view, you've kind of set the tone for people understanding that. The idea here about ending the board meeting with a question is the idea of getting people thinking about the board itself. Like, what was the best part about this board meeting? What did we do well in this board meeting? Just a quick question that gets people to start reflecting. So it's a form of assessment that's just not high level. It's just conversational. What was my role in today's board meeting? And you could do it anonymously, have people fill it out a piece of paper and send it in if you're all working together, and just look. If everybody says, my role was to listen, well, then you know you got to get more people talking. So now you know. So the idea is just to kind of spread around some of the assessment of the board meeting. Now I'm going to move on. Jonathan, handing it off to you. Oh, there's my matrix. I forgot I put that in there. So the matrix is the idea. I put a red circle. I would expand on age range and race ethnicity. I couldn't do it for this picture, but instead of just saying age range, I would actually list the age range, like on an Excel spreadsheet. Under 35, 35 to 50, 50 to 65, something like that. Race and ethnicity, I would spell those out. As Caucasian, African-American, Asian, all the different groups you're working with that you want in there so that people can check. Because then what you're doing is looking across and saying, where do we have gaps? And it makes it a little easier to have a conversation. Even if you look around the room and everybody's white and over 65, sometimes it makes it easier to look at it this way on a piece of paper. The expertise that's circled in green is the idea of what skill sets do people bring, which is another way to start looking at what do you need for your board. I don't recommend necessarily dumping all these into your spreadsheet. I'm just sharing with you all the possibilities. You should narrow it in based on the idea of what does your board want to accomplish this year? And then what skill and connections are we missing? Jonathan.
Awesome. The next kind of tip we have is defining diversity. Now, we say this too because every organization is different. We all have different stakeholders, you're in different communities, you're in different areas. You're going to have different types of people that you're interacting with. And it's important for you to understand how to define diversity based on your specific organization. I know, same with upstate New York and North Carolina, I can imagine like the urban communities and the rural communities might have different populations. So like, what's important to understand who's in your community and who's kind of a part of your organization so you can best define how you want diversity. Because you don't want to just define diversity as like, we want to check off every box. We want to define diversity as like, here's the people that are interacted with our organization and let's make sure that representation is on our board. So we'll go to the next slide, Jean, and it has different components of people you should look at in regard to, diversity. Like, so think about who are you serving? Like, who are the members of your organization and who's receiving the recipients? I know, for example, our organization, we got data from our state agency that 40% of youth in the foster care and homeless care system are LGBTQ. Well, do we have that representation on our board to ensure their needs are met? Because that's a huge part of the population that's served. So we need to understand how we can ensure that representation is on board. Who are your partners? And this is not just, other organizations and nonprofits you're working with, but business partners, banking partners, vendors. Who are you working with? And how does that representation show up on your board as well? Think about the influencers in your organization and your community. Who's helping make those decisions? Who's driving change and who's doing that? How can you, and kind of think of that influencers in your community. That might be community leaders or parents or other types of stakeholders that might show a breadth of that. Like, how are they influencing and what is the representation of those groups? Obviously, community members, what does your community look like and who are you serving and what is the demographics of that community specifically? And then last, your investors. I mean, I'm a fundraiser, you have to be cognizant about fundraising, thinking about who's supporting your organization and what's the demographic of that as well. But this will kind of think about how you can define who you're already working with and then maybe open some potential with that as well. And then Jill just asked a question about, do you recommend setting goals around group representation? Yes, we'll dive more into that in recruiting, but this is a great way where you can say, oh, we have, as I mentioned, 40% of the people we serve or the youth we serve are LGBTQ, but we don't have that. Then you can go to people when you're recruiting and say, we need this representation on our board, and because we serve that right now and we don't have that, and you can be more transparent about the ask so people can feel more connected to the mission of why not just their skill set is important, but who they are is important for showing up on that board. So it's good to kind of help set the stage for you to define how you can potentially set some goals around recruiting.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Jonathan, if you approach somebody, so we've identified on our board a lack of representation from the LGBTQ+ community.
Yeah.
If we have never approached anybody and specifically named that gap and asked them, I'm wondering, Okay, I think Julie just said it. Is that person gonna feel like the
Tokenism.
token LGBTQ plus person on our board, and that's the reason they're being asked?
You know what? We might dive into this more later. I'd rather be upfront and honest about it first and be transparent about that. And if you have all this assessment and conversations in advance of recruiting that individual on your board, you're cognizant of that issue and you're cognizant of doing that. So, you're not just recruiting someone who may be LGBTQ and you're not telling them why, you're just like, oh, let's just get them on the board and doing that. But you're not honest about that in the recruitment process. It's going to feel like a token later if you're not being upfront and transparent about that too as well. And a lot of ways to avoid tokenism is like recruiting more than one individual at a time. So you're not just picking one person. You're like, okay, you check the box, you're great. Like you're recruiting 3 people who are coming on together. So they have a support system to kind of build on that as well. Or again, you're being transparent about what your needs are and why, not just who they are as a person, but their skill set in addition. So that's why that matrix is good too. So you're not just recruiting an LGBT person to be LGBT, you're recruiting them to say, you're also a great finance person and we need people on our finance committee, or you're a great fundraiser and we need to do that too. Or you're from this part of the county and we don't have people from that part of the county and your representation is valuable. So it's not just picking one aspect of it, it's looking at the whole person of that and kind of building on that as well. So I hope that kind of helps that. And actually the next tip kind of will help engage the conversation at your board and your organization, because the next step we have is holding a crucial conversation. So kind of building up and being your board prepared on making sure that you're having those open and honest conversations related to DEI and your board, because that's what's going to help your organization, your board be comfortable talking about this and being open on that as well. And you know what? The good candidates of people who are from underrepresented groups are going to know, they're going to see right through it. If you're going to say, oh, I'm recruiting this person and they're not, I'm just checking a box. Like we know, like we can read through you, like they're smart and you want smart people to do that. And you kind of, but if you're being transparent and doing it, that kind of helps with that. So thanks for the question, Jane.
Yeah, I just want to jump in and say there was an article, and I can send the link to you, Heather, to put up with this from, I think his name is Jim Taylor. He's a vice president or something at Board Source. And it was really fascinating. It was about recruiting. He's an African-American man. And he talked about his experience. And he said he's had some really good experience with being recruited and some not so good. And so he talked about it. And one of the ideas he said was, what was not good is somebody wanted to recruit him. And he said, great, what is it about me that makes you want to be on the board? And the person stumbled and couldn't answer. And he said, it became clear to him he was only being asked because he was an African-American. Whereas the ones that were successful where people said, well, you have this skill set, or you do this, or we've known you from here. So they did their homework and they could put a whole package like Jonathan was saying. And the reason the article is good is because it's a person's experience. And he wrote it up in a way that makes you really realize that it's more than just who you present as, it's what else you bring. But I can send that link to you, Heather, and you can add it up to this workshop. Great. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Awesome. Thanks, Jean. Yeah, totally agree. And we're going to dive more into stuff like this to hopefully help prepare you. But the next tip, we had third one for assessment, is holding crucial conversations. And this is really making sure your board is comfortable talking about these tough topics, because that's going to be an important part in any aspect of things, is making sure that you're actually having the conversation. So here, these are 7 principles that you can think about when ensuring that you're having a crucial conversation. And you can share these principles with your board too, to say like, okay, we're going to talk about a tough topic. Let's make sure we're aware of these actions. So, starting from the heart, really being connected with the individual, looking for connections with each other so that we're not just siloing ourselves, but we're looking to build a connection, making it safe for people, sharing your own personal story as well, stating your goals and hopes. What are you hoping? What are your intentions by it? Helping explore other people's paths. And then, lastly, moving to action. So thinking about how you can set the stage so that you're having honest conversations and you're the most authentic with kind of building with each other as well. So these kind of like are good ways to kind of think about being prepared to have those like tough conversations too. And this slide right here, these are 3 levels of questions that you can kind of ask your board, depending on your comfort level of what you can ask them to what's more how to navigate. So I'd love to hear from all of you. I'll go through each of them, but like what question would make sense for your board right now? Like, what question would you ask too? You know, the first one's like, do you believe our organization's ability to execute our mission to be impacted by the composition of our board with regard to diversity? Do you think like that's a good question? Do you think you've answered that? The second one's like, how are we willing to change to advance diversity on our board? And it's like moving forward to talking about the change that you want to happen too as well. And then lastly, like, how has our organization been complicit in perpetuating systemic oppression, and are we going to change moving forward? So these are questions you can have related to how your organization is set up and the mission and impact that you want to happen, and you can engage in those crucial conversations to kind of think about how to build on that. So I'd love to hear if anyone, like, if any of these questions would be helpful, which one would make sense for your board right now in regard to asking that question to start an important conversation. You can type in the chat or come on mute. I see Jane came out mute.
I think they're all great questions. I think about these like our organization and affiliate has done a ton of work on representation over the last 5 years. So I think these are kind of reflect, not that the work's ever finished, it's ongoing all the time, but I think these would have been tougher for our board to dive into 5 years ago. Now I think we could speak to both the learnings we've experienced over the last 5 years and how we're going to keep it moving forward. I mean, the first one was like that was what drove it for us. It was like, we cannot do this work well if we don't look more like our community and the students we serve. But I think the third question definitely came up for our board and our internal staff a lot in the summer of 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. I mean, just thinking through, you know, we operate within a system, and that system certainly has been affected by systemic oppression, and we've been complicit in that in some ways. I think they're all great questions. Thank you for putting them up.
Awesome. Thanks, Jane. And thanks for being so honest about it too, because we're all in different parts of our journey. So as you mentioned, 5 years ago, you would have been like, we're not answering these questions. We're not doing this too. And there's some boards out there that are like that, you know, but it's great to then think about how we can continue asking these questions and asking these questions as you bring in new people too, so you can engage the conversation with the new folks on too, so they know it's continuing on that as well. That will help kind of drive forward with these conversations and this action.
Sure. And like, what blind spots have I identified over the past 5 years? You know, I think, but I've surely had new things crop up that I'm not seeing now.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Jane.
Well, like you said, it's ongoing. It's not like we've reached it, because even though you're in a new spot, you could actually go back to these questions again and say, where are we now? Because as people kind of have better insight, they might answer the same question 5 years later a lot differently and have a deeper conversation or more. I might share more, or I might be the one who was quiet 5 years ago and I'm willing to talk now. So what we have.
I'm sorry, I just had a question. I love all these questions. I was curious about number 3, and it seems like from Jane's experience that did not shut down conversation, but I just wonder if that question could really be actually not a facilitator of conversation, but rather well, this is, you know, like almost like a shut down question. And I just wondered if you had any help with my understanding about that, or things to think through. I think I like, everybody's on a different journey, and I just don't know if people would be like, yes, I would love to chat about how I've been perpetuating systemic racism. Like,
oh, okay. Thanks, Julie. And thanks for the honesty. Yeah, we kind of put 1, 2, 3 as like kind of different levels of where you would start and kind of build on that too. So maybe your board isn't ready to have that conversation at 3, because I haven't really done that, but you know, starting with 1 or 2 and just saying like, how are we willing to change? Like, is this affecting us as well? And maybe part of those initial conversations is they need some education material related to how they're perpetuating. And then you provide that educational material, and then you have the conversation, be like, okay, you read this book now that, you know, it's talking about, you know, racism in schools, like, and we're like, and that we've read this book. Now, how is this related to the organization? So kind of, as we mentioned, it's a journey. So you build up to that point. So you're having those conversations, like relating it to your mission and vision is always a great way to kind of start people to be like, how is this affecting as well? Because that's why they're there, you know, to help advance the mission and vision of the organization. And then when you identify gaps or learning opportunities from that, maybe build on that too. And then it leads up to that third conversation.
So I have a suggestion also, Julie or anybody could come up with a list of questions and either have a ad hoc committee of your board or have your board vote on them and say, which one do we want to start with? Which one do we want to do later? And so they kind of set the order, and, you know, we can pick the first ones. The article that I'm going to give to you from, I think his name is Mr. Taylor at Board Source, I would recommend giving that to your board to read and then having people reflect on what were your reactions to this? What did you learn? Because he has, it's not like mind numbing. He just has an interesting story about what it was like to be recruited, and you're going to learn something. And that way you start the conversation based on an article you've read. Okay. So we talked about number one we talked about readiness. We said assess your board readiness to make sure, actually like what Julie's saying, you don't want to jump in ahead of where you are, but you know, if a board's not comfortable having a conversation, then you might not be ready to jump to recruitment. So that's kind of the idea here, is look at readiness. Learn how to start having some conversations. Make sure your people know what diversity is, because it could vary depending on who you're serving, and assess board readiness. So what I'd like you to do in the chat box, we've given you a couple of ideas. What's an idea that's going to stick with you under this? And not just assess board readiness, but I talked about polls, we talked about the matrix, and under define diversity, Jonathan talked about being clear on who you're working with and who are the communities, and some other ideas around recruitment, you know, not that you've seen in some of the comments here, not token. And then under the crucial conversations, kind of have layered. So put in the chat box, what's an idea that's you're either going to follow up on or it's sticking with you, but don't hit send. Don't hit send till I say ready. I want to give everybody a chance to type something in. So I'll give you a minute to think about what's kind of something that's going to stick with you from this first section. And sticking with you could mean you're puzzled by it, so you're going to go seek out more info. Okay, another 20 seconds for you to type in any of your thoughts right now. There's a method to this madness, or maybe there's madness to this method. Okay, hit send. I'm looking at some of the comments here. Culture of inquiry, Niles like that. Electra said the pro-con roles. Yeah, that gets kind of healthy conversation going. Let's see, pro and con. Jill's talking about unpacking Jonathan's framework. Jane likes the idea of assigned reading. So as you see already, there are a lot of different places you can start with and think about, how do we get this going? If you take a board that's just sitting there worried about the mission and kids, and suddenly you want them to have this conversation on diversity, everybody kind of gets worried they're going to say the wrong thing or step on somebody's toes, and they start, you know, putting up walls. So part of what you're saying is, you know, an assigned reading, the pro and con discussions, you know, culture of inquiry. These are steps to move you forward. If you're already moving forward, then it helps maybe move deeper. We didn't call it that. We called it moving forward. But if you're already moving good, move deeper. You know, go back and recycle these conversations with a new group of people. You have a new board every year. If new people show up, I wasn't part of your last year's conversation. So you can keep working forward in that way. Jill, did you want to say anything else about your comment? You want to have your board unpack Jonathan's framework for different groups?
I just really like the way he thought about that a little bit differently. You know, we've looked at the board profile sheet before, but that's sort of another layer of the board profile sheet to think about sort of who are the big stakeholders that are part of who we are and make up our framework, and making sure that we're also not losing sight of that when we're looking at all of these things in a grid.
Great, thank you. Somebody else have something to say? Okay. Move on to the next. We already did this. What ideas of readiness are sticking with you? Recruitment, want to talk about how can you integrate recruitment practices and apply a DEI or EDI lens, whatever your words are, equity, diversion, and inclusion.
So our fourth one is determine your value proposition. So I bring this up because, there, as you mentioned, kind of recruiting for diversity can be hard. And if there's only certain people engaged in your community from underrepresented groups, it can be pretty competitive. I know, like, we had a group of 13 young people excited to join boards, and over 100 nonprofits reached out asking if they can be on their board. And I'm like, they're overwhelmed with the response of like, oh, great, doing that. But, the way to stand out for your organization is determine your value proposition. So what makes it exciting to be on your board? And it's good to kind of answer that, so then you can kind of be prepared to answer those questions when you're recruiting people and building on that, and then really determine kind of the value that you bring to kind of recruiting as well, and kind of have engaging conversations so people are excited about it and they're bringing to the table. So the next slide, we're going to try an activity. I don't know if any of you have annotated any before, but if you go to the top of the screen and hit view options and go to annotate, you can put a stamp, and you can put like an X or something on the screen. You can kind of say, put one down. So you can put an X like that, and you should be able to see that. What we're going to do is I'm going to talk about all these questions briefly, but I'd love to hear what question stands out to you right now, of like what curious question stands out of like, and then I'll kind of start from that order. So if you can go for that, we're trying to get you engaging and moving that way too as well. If the annotate option doesn't work, you can just type it in the chat as well. But I'd love to see like what question here are you most curious about answering. So I see Julie made a nice star, so thank you. Elizabeth.
Finding annotations, you go up to the top. I think it's a little toolbar that appears next to whoever's speaking, whoever's screen you're seeing. I think it might say you're seeing Jean Allen's screen.
And it says view option. When you click on view options, you go down to annotate, and it pops up the toolbar to pick your flavor of flair.
Mm-hmm. That's a nice way to say it, Heather. Flavor flair. Using that next time.
You can steal it. You can take it.
Awesome. So I see some folks answering here as well, and I'll see number 4 is the board represented the population served. I'll start with that one. So this is a question to really think about for that, because this is a question people ask, assessing your board diversity. Like that's kind of the nice way and the comfort level to assess people. Like, is that the way as well? So you want to make sure anyone related to recruiting for your organization is prepared to answer that answer well, and answer that authentically too. Like you don't want you don't want to make your organization look bad, but you want to be honest and build a kind of honest picture of what that kind of description is, so you can kind of say that. So you can say like, most of our board connects with the community, but we're lacking these people. That's why you'd be great to be on the board as well. Or we're not getting there yet. We went through some hardship and some board turnover. So now we're kind of focusing on making sure representation is on the board. And that's why we're connecting with you. So you can kind of prep those answers. I see a handful of folks interested in the crisis question. So this is especially important with COVID. Everyone went through some type of crisis in the last couple of years as well. And I saw, I was working for a community foundation most of COVID, and I saw a lot of organizations where their board went in crisis. And you want to know how people are handling that. Like, are they freezing? Are they stopping doing anything? Are they jumping in, or are they advocating for resources or stepping up too as well? Or what does that kind of look? Or some boards like put all their power in a few people, and then they just make all decisions, and then you are excluding the great diversity that you had with that as well. So it's a kind of good way for you kind of think about how you're handling crisis, because people want to know that too, because crisis is inevitable. Change is the only constant going on for our sector, and we need to make sure that we're prepared to handle all these changing crises too as well. So think about ways you can answer that question so that when people are engaging with that, you're best prepared. I see one for the structure of the board. how do you make decisions? And as I kind of just mentioned before, like sometimes you have the board, but only a few people are really making the decisions. And that's not super exciting for anyone new to come on and say like, oh, well, I'm not really going to have a voice. I'm just here to do that. How are you structure the organization so everyone has autonomy of what they're doing and how they're building on that, and how to prepare that conversation. So when someone's coming in, you know, for the finance related or the fundraising side or the program element side, they feel like they have a voice and they can build on that board and kind of feel connected with that too as well. Number two, I'll just quickly say like skills and perspective, add value to the board. That goes back to your matrix and saying like, and being honest with them and saying like, you know, we're looking at you because we are looking at your whole picture as well. Like, for example, I just got asked to be joined on the governance committee for AFP Global, and they, you know, were like, you've done a lot of great governance work and build that. We're excited, but you're also going to be the youngest person on, and we need like more young voices. And that's kind of why we were thinking about you as a whole person. So they're thinking about me as a whole person and how I'm bringing to the board. And that felt a better ask than just say like, oh, we need you because we're checking off a box. You know, that kind of builds that transparency with that too, and looks at the whole person rather than as well. And then lastly, the giving and fundraising expectations of the board. As a fundraiser, I'm always making sure people are prepared to answer this question. Beyond that, I don't know if you all have giving expectations on it. I know many boards do, but be honest about that, you know, up front, and be prepared to answer that question. And don't make assumptions too. Just don't assume that people are coming from certain aspects of communities that they don't have wealth or access to wealth, or they don't feel engaged or building on that too. I know some of the biggest assets I've had for board members and fundraising are the people who are directly connected to the mission is best. And then they've helped leverage more dollars and more coming in as well. So, and that's an expectation you can share in the beginning. You know, if I'm not coming in with a lot of money, and I know a lot of my other young professional colleagues aren't, but we might be more energetic or more likely to connect or more engage in some other activities that might yield some results. So making sure you're prepared to answer that question so people are comfortable with that. So these are just questions you, like anyone recruiting, just put up bullet points and talking points when you're prepared to have those conversations with people so that they're most comfortable answering those questions and kind of engaging that conversation when recruiting.
Great. Next, we're going to talk about building relationships. The idea, whoops, I went ahead of building relationships. We put this under recruitment because it was more than just going out and recruit. It's how can you start building relationships? The idea would be invite community leaders into your arena before you're recruiting people. So here's an example that I've read, talked to some people about, that they were successful in. They had a one-time meeting of community leaders, maybe somebody from a particular African-American church, somebody from the school system, somebody from a community center, the people in the community that had connections. And they invited those people to come to a one-time meeting where they weren't recruiting. They said, we just want to talk to you about our program, what we're trying to achieve. Here's what we're about. You bring a couple of board members in, you just have a conversation. And then you say to them, who would you recommend that we go contact? So you're asking them to help you leverage some contacts. And it could be they say, well, I'm interested, but that's not your point. Your point is you're using these leaders in the community to get to the next round of people who you might not know, the small business people, the people who are out there making things happen that aren't necessarily the leaders of the organization. So it's called kind of a one-time meeting. You could do this once a year and invite people in. And I would say you're thinking about inviting 5 or 6 people in. You're not inviting a huge crowd. It's kind of intimate. You just have an hour-long conversation. If it's in person, you could have a breakfast and have it from 8 to 9 and just have people come by, or 4 to 5. So what you're doing is reaching out to community leaders and asking them to share, after they've heard what you're doing and why you're doing it and what you're about, who they would recommend. Another idea would be, kind of Jonathan talked about this, is the idea of in building relationships when if you're trying to diversify your board, bringing on not necessarily a lot of, bring on 3 people. Somebody might be your youngest person. Somebody might be your first person who's Asian. Somebody might be your first person who's African-American. But as a group, you're bringing in a lot of different voices. So people have that sense. It doesn't mean you have to pair people up and bring in, 2 Asian Americans or 2 African Americans or 2 young people together, but bring in a pool of people who are bringing new voices, because you've done that other work of getting people talking ahead of time. Trying to think what other ideas you could ask your staff what volunteers they have and have a meeting with your volunteers who are in key leadership positions and say, who do you know that might be interested in being on the board? So you're kind of reaching out in different areas. What you're trying to do here is plan ahead of time before you get into recruitment, build those relationships, knowing what's going on in terms of, we're going to look down this road and bring people in. I have a couple of ideas. I was going to see if I mentioned all my ideas. I think I did say my ideas here. Really. And you could also write a letter to other organizations in your community. Reach out, have conversations with people. But what you're doing is not asking them and just saying, you're putting it in the context of your organization. This is what we're trying to achieve. These are the changes we're trying to make. This is why we're doing this. Are there people you would suggest we need to talk to? A lot of places a lot of nonprofits don't think to go to the Chamber of Commerce, which has small businesses. A lot of people who own small businesses are different voices than the people who work in the corporate world. Who works in your Chamber of Commerce? Who's a member there? Have conversations. If you're a member as an executive director or board member and you go to the chamber, use that as an opportunity not to actually recruit, but to build a relationship. So then you can use that relationship to have a conversation about recruitment.
Awesome. And our 6th tip for the day is staying authentic. So we bring this up because you want to make sure people can be authentic on your board. You know, myself and the group of emerging leaders, like the number one takeaway they got out of the program is they want to find a space where they can be their most authentic self and show up on the board and not have to kind of deal with some other areas they might have to deal in their workplace. You know, some of us are going to the workplace and we're the only queer person, we're the only person of color, we're the only young person. And it's exhausting sometimes to work in those spaces because then you're code switching, you're navigating issues, microaggressions, and for you to do something on top of that extra and you have to kind of do that too in your extra space can be even more exhausting and less motivating to do that. So you want to make sure that you can stay authentic yourselves, but you can promote other people to be authentic selves when they come to your organization and be authentic and kind of building on that. So the next slide has some kind of tips to kind of think about how you can promote authenticity and build on that. So, you know, the number one is being vulnerable. Vulnerability is a strength. I also have a social work degree and that's coming out of me as well. So like you're going to learn and kind of grow your most when you're comfortable enough and safe enough to be vulnerable. So you want that, making sure that your board members are okay being vulnerable, talking about these issues and building on that. Ownership is another thing, feeling ownership in the organization, in their work, in their contribution to them, making sure that they feel like they're actually part of it and kind of have autonomy over their work. Motivation to grow. And this is not just professionally, like developing your professional skills and network, just personally, you know, are all your board members motivated to assess their privilege and assess how that shows up in their board or tackle their implicit biases and how to do that? How are you ensuring people are motivated to keep going and keeping change and kind of building on that? Empathy is a big thing too, as well. How can you strengthen your empathetic skills so that people can relate to others and may not fully understand where they're coming from, but can get a picture so that they're likely to adapt and change or make kind of equitable decision-making, knowing that someone else has a different life perspective than theirs. And they can kind of ensure that they're being empathetic and understanding to that situation. Strengths focus. I'm a big person, I'm focusing on your strengths. Like, what are you good at? What do you love? And what do you bring to the table? And you making sure that people are kind of working their best in their strengths and working best of how they feel most comfortable in as well. So like, you know, don't make the young people just go on social media because like that's what you think that is. You know, they might not like it. It might not be too overwhelming too as well. They might be a great accountant and it's just hitting behind them as well. So think about their strengths of what they love doing and how you can kind of embrace those and bring them as well. And then inclusion. So thinking about what's the culture on the board like? How are you ensuring people feel welcome when they're coming in? what are the conversations like before you start talking about business? You know, for example, I had one person come to a board and everyone on the board was talking about their second home in their like lake house. And this young person didn't even have a home, like they didn't own a home for as well. So they felt so excluded in the conversation. And that's what they were bonding over and connecting of like where they're going for their lake house for the summer. And then they're like, I don't even have my own home. Like they felt so excluded. So just being conscious of those conversations of what you're maybe connecting with and everyone else on the board is connecting, but that might exclude some people coming in and not understanding that as well. And maybe it's a place to kind of bring in different people and kind of aspects of that. So these are just conditions to kind of make sure you're being authentic yourselves and promoting authenticity on your board.
Oh, this is kind of what we just talked about. We're going to cycle back in a minute to look at those, but we want to get to the last three ideas. Oh. Onboarding. Why does that have anything to do with diversity? This is how you make people feel comfortable, but you don't just start that once you start getting diversity. You start that as a practice now. I find that a lot of what people talk about with diversity on boards is just plain good business. It's like, how do we make people feel comfortable on this board? How do we make sure people can have conversations? So start it now, no matter who's on your board, so that when you start bringing diversity or when you deepen your diversity, you already have these good practices in place. So one of the first practices is the idea that I offer is embracing board buddies. This is the idea that as soon as you have new members voted into your board, you get people to call them up. And so basically you assign a new person to one person on the board. So Jane's new and Niles is new and Julie's new, and we get Elizabeth to call one and Electra to call one and Kevin to call one. And you call somebody up and say, hey, this is Jean Allen. I'm on ABC board. I look forward to meeting you there. And if you're having meetings in person, then you say, when you come to the first meeting, I'm going to introduce you to the board. I'm going to save you a seat. So when you walk in the room, come sit next to me. I mean, how hard is it to walk in a room if you have never been in that room before, and to have somebody meet you at the door and go, hey, come sit next to me? It's like, you're over the first hump. If you're meeting by Zoom, I can still say, I'm going to introduce you at the next meeting. Tell me something about you, about your family life. Tell me something about your work life. What do you want people to know about you? So what you have is my enthusiasm to connect this person in introducing them. But what you also have is 6 board members who are involved at this moment. So we're engaging a lot of board members because we have 3 new people who are being introduced, and we have 3 current board members who are introducing them. So the second part of Board Buddy, call, you introduce, and then you follow up. And the follow up is after the first board meeting, I call you up and say, let's set a time to chat, and maybe in a week. And I call them up and I say, hey, how did the board meeting go for you? Anything that we did, it didn't make sense? Because I know every board uses jargon, blah, blah, blah. So basically, the way I define Board Buddy is it's very small. It's not a one-year get married situation. It's call them up when they're soon on the board, introduce them at the first meeting, and then follow up maybe after 1 or 2 meetings. And then you say, hey, I'm around, but you're on your own now. I don't want you to, I was just here to get you flying. Now you're flying. Bye. But if you start doing that for all your board members, you're engaging people, and you're making it part of your practice to invite and encourage new people. Because sometimes if I come into a board and I stand out, I feel very awkward. But if I'm invited in, I feel welcomed. So just start that as your general practice. The next one is involve current board members. Well, I just gave you one idea. This is about the onboarding process. So I'm just curious for you to answer this question in the chat box. How do you currently involve your board members in your onboarding? A is only the ED does it. B, only the ED and the board chair does the onboarding. Or C, the executive director, the board chair, and other board members. So just put your answer in the chat box. Which one of these is the way you onboard your board members? And I'm hoping you do some sort of onboarding. We're making that assumption. So go ahead and put it in and hit return or send. Hey, Niles, you said you have a lot of people involved in the orientation and the onboarding. Do you do it at a regular meeting or between meetings?
I would say it's between meetings. And I'm thinking about my personal experience of when I joined the board, and it was very helpful that, as I said, both the board chair at that time and our CEO also, invited me and welcomed me into the first meeting, and then several board members followed up with me after that. So I'm not sure, and Jane, you might have a perspective on how formal our process is, but my experience is that we have a very, our board is very welcoming, and that numerous members kind of reach out to help new members feel welcome. So that's my personal experience.
Yeah, I would say what you want to do is make sure you're doing that intentionally and not just because you have extroverts on your board who do it. And once they leave, you forget to do it. So build it into your practices. And so the idea here would be, you, especially if you're doing onboarding via Zoom, you could ask a board member to come in at 10 minutes after and speak for 3 minutes and leave another board member. You can engage little pieces, have board members talk about little parts of being on the board, so that this goes back to Julie's comment that was in there. You're getting your current board members involved, and that's the leadership position they're getting in, because they're standing up and inviting, welcoming the next round. So just those are the ideas of how do you get other board members involved. Jonathan, hit us up with the last one.
Sure. And the last one is create a checklist. So this is a great way to kind of just organize your onboarding and kind of figure it out and kind of make it pretty organized. So the board I was on, and I was board chair, and we were realizing, man, onboarding boards were a lot because we were a pretty working board and kind of doing that. So I actually adapted this from a board source resource, and I just put down all the things people needed to know to be on the board and put it in this checklist, and then gave it to them right when they started, so that they felt self-directed of knowing how they can get all the information possible to kind of ensure that they're best prepared to be on the board as well. So you'll see here, like it's broken down by like programs, organizational history, board member responsibilities. And you'll see here, part of it is reviewing materials, but part of it is meeting someone. So the red arrow right there is schedule a meeting with the governance chair to review board member responsibilities. So making sure that they're engaged with different people in different leadership positions, so that they're organized and they feel connected, or they know who to go to ask questions related to certain areas as well. And this also helps that intentionality of in getting other board members involved, so that they also know their responsibilities for that too. So this is the second part. So finances, fund development. So schedule a meeting, with other people and doing that. And you'll see here too, I put an asterisk, like can be done in onboarding. One year we didn't have the capacity to do an onboarding section because we were so small, but another year we did, and we had different board members hop in and Zoomed, and they went over the expectations in doing that. So people felt like if they attended the onboarding session, they could check off most of the checklist as well. So that could be part of it too. Like you could get most of this during an onboarding session, or if they don't have capacity to attend, or you don't, doing that, life gets busy, they can be self-directed on building that. And this was supposed to be completed in the first 6 months of them coming on the board. And this is a great way to engage the board buddy again, because then they would check in and be like, how are you doing on your checklist? How are you doing that as well? And it gives them a nice outline to just understand where they're going from, and a kind of an accountability tool to make sure that they're doing the best they can to build on it as well. So
Great. So we're near the end. These are the 9 ideas we shared with you. We want to do something with you, a little trying something. We're sending you a link to a Google Doc. We want you to go in and just type your first name and what's one takeaway you have from today. It's a different way to have a discussion. So just put your first name in, and then what's a takeaway you have? The chat box disappears, but we can leave this up here and come back and look at it. If I'd known who was here ahead of time, so you can use this with your board, I pre-populate it with names. And then you can ask board members to go in and type something. So if you're at a board minute, this is a way to have a discussion that lets the introverts as well as the extroverts contribute.
mm-hmm.
Julie likes the idea of board buddies. Yeah, you can make it as big and small as you need, Julie, to make it kind of work for your board. Culture of inquiry, pro-con roles. The pro-con roles, I find, like, somebody said in the chat box, it's about learning healthy debate and discussion, because we don't know how to do that right now in this country. We're really crazy. So if you can set up a way that people can discuss with each other. Elizabeth likes culture of inquiry. Niles likes culture of inquiry. Y'all like that. That's good. What we're trying to do is create an environment where diversity will flourish on your board. Oh, Heather, do we need to let people go?
Let people go?
Well, how much time do we have?
No, you have another 12 minutes.
So we want to hear from y'all. What kind of questions do you have?
This is not a question, but the conversation. I work with the national office, so we get to work with other boards in the network. And a conversation that has been coming up is when they're trying to diversify their board. And many of them used to have these give and get policies, and they were really had to spend time reflecting in how do they articulate that in a way that one doesn't make assumptions, like Jonathan said, but also in a way that doesn't put people uncomfortable either, you know? And so people have been just kind of really thinking about that, you know, like, do we have to define the amount? What happens if we don't define the amount? And how could that help or not help and move it? Because so many have been so used to like, or let's get the biggest givers on our board and then making assumptions of where to get that. And then is there space for alumni? Is there space for, you know, other stakeholders? So it has just led to rich conversations about how we look at our boards. I just wanted to.
Jonathan, you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, there's a complicated answers and kind of stuff like that too as well. And maybe it's kind of having discussions about how much influence fundraising and giving has on your board, because then you might be excluding people if you were like expecting that as well. I, as a fundraiser, I always like to say, like, I recommend each board member make the organization one of their philanthropic priorities. So that's what to say. So like, it's a matter of different gift as well, different levels, but everyone should have an expectation and gift for that. Because sometimes you might set an amount and it's too high for some people, or frankly, if you got someone really wealthy and you're like, you set that amount and it's too low, like you can get more money out of them as well, because they just might come in that as well. But if you're on the board and you're giving X amount of money to that as well, we should be part of that larger pot of that money because you're prioritizing on that as well. So that kind of helps give that to, because then people can do that as well. I like setting fundraising plans and expectations so that they have an action plan coming in, because everyone can have different ways of contributing to fundraising that could be beneficial. So some people might like asking, they may be comfortable with it. Some people might be the party planners and getting people together and building each other up as well. Some people might love those thank you notes, like they might be the best thank you note writer ever as well. So you can kind of think about different ways that board members can contribute to fundraising, because then it can expand on that and it's more task focused and more like expecting them as well. Of course, we want their network to be engaged, and that's why we engage network as well. But like, it's thinking about what they're actually able to do to contribute to that as well. And that kind of might stem from that too. So you might have, folks like myself who a little bit younger, and we might not have built up wealth yet, but we might be more eager to do more tasks or related to that too. So it's just kind of shifting that to not just giving and getting, but like, what's a comprehensive way that you can contribute to fundraising efforts and how to support that as well. And there's some great sample philanthropy action plans that you can kind of create that could help engage that conversation. So Jean, I don't know if you have anything else to add on that.
If it's part of the recruiting process, you want to be honest with people that you need to say, this is a fundraising board, but here's how we handle fundraising. And you can describe your process, because some boards aren't fundraising boards. Yeah. And somebody might come to you from being on a board and not realize that that's going to be important. So I would say, yes, you need to say one of the roles of this board is to do fundraising, but here's the way we do it. And here's one suggestion I've offered to groups who they want to have on their board people of different economic backgrounds, because that's who they serve. So they can have a collective board goal. And they say, together, we want our board to raise, or we say, let's give or get, we say, have a conversation with people and say, how much money would you be able to give or find or bring to us between now and the end of the year? And let's say you do this 6 months out. So everybody writes down an amount and you have 10 people in the room, and what you come up with, $20,000. So you say, great, we have a $20,000 board goal collectively. But what they don't know is that one person has said they would give $5,000 and somebody else said they give $50. But we were doing it in a pot together so that one person knows who's giving what and tracks it. But nobody but that one person knows, who's giving the 50 and who's giving the 5,000. So it's just a strategy to kind of share out who's fundraising. So you're announcing it at your board, you're announcing it in your recruitment, but you figure out some ways for people to contribute without having to be set up. And then building on what Jonathan just said, a great conversation to have with your board would be the different elements of fundraising. So there's cultivation, there's solicitation, and there's stewardship. And the cultivation, have them define what would be the task under that. Basically, it's getting to know your community, it's doing outreach, it might be making phone calls. Solicitation is making the actual ask, get your board members to look at these three. I've done this in a retreat with people, so I'm telling you, it's great. The third one is, what are the actions under stewardship? And often that might be writing thank you notes or making phone calls. But the key part of this, after you go through and list these three categories, then you have each board member go stand or acknowledge which one are they most comfortable with. And if all your people go to stewardship because they like to write letters, well, that was true before. Now you know it and you can work with it. So it's not like you're finding out something bad, you're finding out good. But every time I've done this, I've seen at least one person go stand in front of solicitation and say, I like doing this. So then we say, would you be willing to let a board member go with you sometime? You don't have to ask, you just get to walk with them and sit in the room, and you're going to give a one bullet statement about why you're on this board. Would you be willing to learn? And so, you set up a way to help people be more comfortable, but you never want to ask the person who's uncomfortable to do the ask because they won't do it well. And then they get off the board. So it's kind of a little more than what you're asking, Elizabeth, but it's the idea of what Jonathan was saying, be very comprehensive in how we think of fundraising. I know you can't think of board members as ATMs, that's when you get stuck. We need to think of them as whole persons who can bring reputation management and communication and advocacy as well as money to the organization. But it is what people stumble on, because everybody else, like Jonathan said, has a lake house and where they go for a month every year, and you say, let's have diversity and let's bring on people who, it could be very awkward. That's why we're suggesting some of these other steps start you to looking at who are we as a board? What is, this culture of inquiry? How can we learn to discuss things? How can we see who we are? Jonathan and I've had a lot of conversations about this whole idea of value proposition and the work he did with the group, the young nonprofit professionals in his area, and what they want out of board work. And I think what boards want out of young people, and it's not necessarily the same, which makes it interesting because young people want a chance to be part of something where they feel valued. And they want it to be authentic, and they don't want to just be a check off the box. And I'm sure that's true for every racial group and every religious group that represents and is on your board. So it was a very good insight for him to share that. What other reflections or thoughts do y'all have?
This is Julie again. So is it ever appropriate for a board to, I struggle with this define diversity, because some of our affiliates are in really rural, mostly white areas. And I guess I just struggle with can you define diversity if you're just a bunch of white people? I mean, I guess you could have different, economic and other things, but I guess I'm just we get this as feedback a lot, there are no Black people in our area, and I'm like, I don't know if that's always true. And maybe I just was wondering your thoughts on that.
Well, certainly in North Carolina, we have places like Charlotte and Greensboro and Durham that are very different than some of the rural counties that don't have towns. So there is an element of truth in that. It is a challenge, but what I try to say to some of the rural areas is, how could you become a leader in diversity? How could you become the spokespersons around diversity in your community? And the example I give, and I know y'all are in North Carolina, I can say this, Chatham County was a rural county 15 years ago. Chatham County now is an outgrowth of Cary. It has a huge Hispanic population that's moved in. Chatham County has transformed, and maybe you're not going to, but had those people started thinking about how our children are going to graduate and go live perhaps in Charlotte or Durham or Washington, D.C. or Dallas. I mean, how do we become the organization that looks at diversity and has conversations? And we can do that. White people can sit in a room and have that conversation. So part of it is helping people learn to just start talking about things. Now, the interesting story that sticks in my mind was a group in Iowa that had issues because the Catholics and the Protestants, they were all white, but they didn't get along. And that was, 50 years ago, and that was their diversity. So there's always, in groups and out groups. There's everybody who went to school in your rural communities knows there's an in group and an out group. So I would just have people start talking about how are we different here? But there is the other piece around racial pieces. Sometimes in different parts of counties, there's pockets of populations that if you are the white predominant group, you don't even know those groups exist. So sometimes it's learning your community and exploring and making sure, like if you lived in Chatham County, you could miss the fact that there was a whole population of Hispanic immigrants who had moved in, who were having a very thriving community because they lived in a very specific part of Chatham County. In Chatham County, for those that's south of Orange County and kind of southwest of Durham County, so it's getting down in kind of the Sand Hills areas a bit. Anybody else that works or lives in a rural area or has had some thoughts about what you do in rural areas where it appears to be mostly a singular group, even though it's probably not, but it's not Charlotte and it's not Durham.
Gina, I just want to add on your point, because I think really assessing what it is, like as you just mentioned too, like you might discover communities in your organization, in your community that you might not know about as well. And a lot of times, and unfortunately, our system tends to erase, especially folks of color and their kind of demographics in that as well. Like I have connected with some Latinx communities across the country, and a lot of our indigenous community folks get erased a lot because this government didn't want them there. So, but they might be existing and thriving, and they might be measured in the community, might not be there as well. So that's one way to do that. And copy on Jean's thing about being a leader in the area. Who else is trying to kind of amplify DEI efforts in your community? And maybe you partner with them to kind of expand that and build on it as well. So is your chamber doing it? Is there a business really committed? Is there another nonprofit? How can you set the example from it so people see you as that, and then you're going to attract that as well? It's kind of shifting the mindset of like, why can't we find diverse candidates? It might be like, well, why don't diverse candidates find us? Like you think about how you can set yourself up for that and set your value proposition to be a leader on it and be vocal, because then people are going to be attracted to you and want to be a part of that as well.
Well, thank you for being willing to ask questions today and have a conversation. We love when we can get small groups like this because it's a lot more intimate and we can have kind of a great conversation. Yeah, Jane, I agree with you. The great reframing of thinking of things is what's the value proposition? I love that. What's the value proposition for joining your board? And how can you be leader or partner with the leaders in your community? I mean, Charlotte's different than rural areas, and we're all in very different situations. Looking at the comments, somewhere in these comments, Heather put the article from Jim Taylor. I highly recommend reading that article and then sharing it out with your board as an example. That's my takeaway for you. Read that article and give it to your board members and then have a discussion. What did you think about this article? What stood out for you? Where do you see the challenges? Not what's right or wrong or what did you like, but just what stood out, what jumped out at you, and what in there could we use to move forward? So that's my takeaway. Jonathan, you have any last takeaways you want to give everybody?
I would say promote the conversations, like use tools to promote that. Like too many times on boards, we're so focused on the business that we're not actually talking to people and actually having conversations related to this. Now, how are we going to grow if we're not having these conversations? So setting up time in your meetings or outside of your meetings to build those connections and just use articles or tools or videos to kind of help guide those conversations so that you're talking about stuff and not ignoring it or prioritizing other areas, so kind of build on that. So, yeah.
Well, thank y'all for being here today. Here's a slide with our emails on there if you want to reach out to either Jonathan or me for questions that you have. Both of us are willing to answer any questions or reach out, answer your concerns. That's why we like to do this kind of stuff. Thank you. We are appreciative that Heather and NCCIS invited us to be part of this, and we are glad to meet all of you.
Thanks,
Thank you
Jean
so
and
much.
Jonathan. We appreciate you both. It was a great session. And I did put the evaluation in the chat box, so hopefully you pulled that up and can fill that out. And I hope you have a great rest of the day, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.